Hey songwriters, welcome back to another edition of At Home Songwriting. Today we are talking about modes. And modes are a tool that you have that you can throw into your toolbox and use it when you're looking to expand your musical and chord vocabulary when you're trying to communicate emotions or ideas or parts of your stories in your songs. So just like every other tool that we talk about, the reason why you use certain tools is to accomplish some sort of communication of emotion. So a lot of times the mode that you use will determine what emotion is being communicated. Or you could think of it another way is if you want to communicate X emotion, you use Y mode, right? So we're going to talk about kind of the mode basics. But what I want you to know today is learn the basics and then experiment. Because if you just watch this and then you don't use it, you won't really start to learn it. So let's talk about modes. And the first thing that we want you to remember is it's really modes of the major scale. I'll say that again, modes of the major scale. So you're actually using all of the same notes that you probably already know within each major scale, and you can use them to create some really cool colors in your chords and your music. All right, so what is a mode? A mode is really just another name for scale. And like I said, we're talking about modes of the major scale. So in any key or any key signature, there are multiple scales or multiple modes that can be used. And each mode is a scale that starts on a different degree of the major scale. Let me say that again. A mode is a scale that starts on different degrees of the major scale. So why would you want to use modes as a songwriter? Well, modes give you different musical colors to choose from and different overall feel of the chords to try out to see what works best for your song. And different modes are going to deliver that different emotional impact. And it can give your song some extra flavors that your major scales and your minor scales don't. I know a lot of you are familiar with major scales and the relative minor scales. So we're going to go into the relative modes of the major scale. So within any major scale, there are really 7 common modes that you will often hear about. And these are the most common modes that you'll probably end up using within your writing as well. So the modes are starting on the 1, that's the Ionian. Another word for Ionian is the major scale, because that's just the major scale. Building the mode off the 2nd degree of the scale, that's called Dorian. Building it off the 3rd is Phrygian, 4th is Lydian, 5th is Mixolydian, the 6th is Aeolian, and then the 7th is Locrian. So one way to remember this order of modes is to look at the first letter of each mode and kind of use the mnemonic of I don't play like my Aunt Linda, or IDPLMAL. I don't play like my Aunt Linda. That's a good way to remember at least the starting letters, so you can start to remember some of these names that sound more complicated than they actually are. All right, so let's look at what notes are actually in each of these modes or in each of these scales that are a part of the key of C major. So one of the ways that you can start to really understand modes is to start learning them in one particular key and then learn that really well so you can start to transpose the concepts to any key that you're working in. So we're going to start with no sharps, no flats, C major, all the white keys for those of you piano players out there. So your Ionian mode, like we had said, that's the major scale. So that's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, right? Your Dorian then starts on the 2nd degree, which is 2nd degree is D. So Dorian actually goes from D to D. It's D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. And Phrygian is E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. And as you can see, each mode starts on the next degree of the major scale and goes from that note to the octave up using all of the same notes that are in the C major scale, but you're starting on a different degree. So it's actually in a different mode. And what's really cool about modes is even though you're using all the same notes that are in the scale, they have major sonic differences, which we'll explore here in a little bit as well. Your Mixolydian is starting on the 5th degree, which is your G. So that goes G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Aeolian, also known as the relative minor, starts on A and goes to A. That's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. That's a lot of times just called the minor scale. But the mode term for it is Aeolian. And then finally, Locrian goes from B to B, which is B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So now what I'd like to do is show you what these modes sound like. So we're going to start in Ionian in C major. So we're using a program that's called HookPad. It's by hooktheory.com. They're not a sponsor of this video. It's just a tool that I use. I think it's like $4 a month or something like that. Something that you can definitely check out. It really helps you visualize and learn music theory, and it's a great compositional tool as well. So as you can see off to the side here, we're going from the 1 to the 1. So that's the major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So this scale, a lot of times, you're going to know as the major scale. It's the do re mi scale, right? So it sounds very joyful, it sounds very happy, it sounds upbeat, and it sounds like this. So that is your Ionian mode. So that's the color that mode gives you. Now, as you can see up here, the next note, if we move up the scale, the 2nd degree of C is D. So now we're going to go from D to D, which, as we learned before, that's D Dorian. So we are going to now start on the D and go to the D, no sharps, no flats. And again, notice the chords are staying on the D minor. That's really your new home when you're in a mode, because you're starting at a new root note. The degree of the scale that you're starting on becomes your home, your root note. So this is D Dorian. Notice the color that it has. Isn't that cool? It has all the same notes as your other scale, but just starting on that new root chord and then starting on that new degree gives you kind of a minor feel. But the Dorian mode is actually not as dark as your minor key is. So if you're looking for something that has kind of a minor feel, but has a little bit more mystery, a little bit more of something to it, or maybe a little more spice, Dorian might be a good mode to use. It's used a lot in jazz. You'll hear a lot of funk songs, R&B songs are in Dorian as well. So that's starting on the 2nd degree of the major scale. The next mode in C major is built off the 3rd degree, which in C major, that's the E. So now this is Phrygian. This is E Phrygian. It goes from E to E, no sharps, no flats. And this is also considered a minor mode because the first note and the first chord is a minor chord. And listen really closely to this mode because it actually gives you a darker, more kind of menacing sound than your relative minor does. So if you're looking for something that's even darker than a minor key, Phrygian is a good place to start. And Phrygian has kind of an exotic feel to it. Again, using all of the same notes, just a different root and a different starting chord. So this is what Phrygian sounds like. Isn't that cool? You might hear some kind of like heavy metal kind of vibes in there too, because a lot of like heavy metal songs use a lot of Phrygian mode stuff. The next mode we're going to talk about in the key of C is the fourth degree, or the Lydian mode. And in the key signature of no sharps, no flats, the Lydian mode is F Lydian. So that goes from F to F. And this is a major mode. So it's starting on a major chord, and it actually has a brighter, kind of more, I would say, upbeat, kind of exciting sound than even your major key does, because you're sharping the fourth degree of this scale, and it gives you that extra kind of excitement. Listen to this. Doesn't that sound really bright? It sounds really sunny. Just a really cool mode that's kind of fun to write in for sure. So that's F Lydian. Next up is the fifth degree of the C major scale. That's G. So if we're building a scale off of G within no sharps, no flats, we're going to get G Mixolydian. So Mixolydian is also a major mode. And the Mixolydian mode is used a lot in rock music because it has kind of a rock bluesy kind of sound to it. So it's like a major scale, but there's one note that's different. It's the flat 7 that really feels kind of bluesy, funky, and it sounds like this. I can hear, some Beatles songs use Mixolydian. There's a ton of other songs that use Mixolydian as well. It has that fun kind of rocky sound to it. So that's an option you have in your writing. Now we're moving on to the sixth degree of the no sharps, no flats C major scale. And the sixth degree is A. Your sixth degree is also known as the relative minor, or this is the Aeolian mode, as we said. So in C major, your relative minor is A minor. So that's where we're starting on this mode. So this is another minor mode, and you'll see that this has that more traditional minor sound. It's not as dark as Phrygian, and it's not as bright as Dorian. Take a listen. So that is the minor mode, or Aeolian mode. And finally, on our modal journey through the key of C major, no sharps, no flats, we come to the seventh degree, which is the B. So we're starting on B and going to B. And this is technically a minor mode, but it's starting on the B diminished chord. So it has a very dissonant chord sound to start. And the Locrian mode isn't used a whole lot in commercial music because it's harder to establish what key you're in when you're dealing with a diminished sort of feel. So listen to how it kind of doesn't feel like there's any tonal center to it. It just feels like it's kind of, Locrian has kind of a, I don't want to say evil sound to it, but it's kind of a wonky, dark kind of feel. This is the Locrian mode. In one of my workshops, someone said that it sounds cinematic, like it could be part of a movie. And I think that's true. It kind of has this dissonant, sort of suspenseful, just kind of unsettled feel to it. So that is the Locrian mode. So now that we've listened to each mode, we kind of have a sense of what each mode sounds like. You have your major modes, which are the Ionian, the Lydian, and the Mixolydian, built on the first, the fourth, or the fifth degree of the scale. Then you have your minor modes, which are the Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Those are built on the second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh degree of your scale. Now the trick is when you're writing, how do you know which chords to use to put your song into these modes? So take a screenshot of this chart or write down some of the information. I'll also put a link in the description so you can download this. I made this for myself so I can kind of know which chords work within a certain mode within this particular key. If you're looking to transpose to another key, you'll have to do the transposition yourself. I didn't get super complicated with this. But this gives you an idea of what chords kind of work within the different modes. So the way that you think about this and the way that you establish a mode is you start your section on the root. So that means if you're writing in Phrygian, you're going to want your first chord in that chord progression to be the E minor chord if you're playing in the key of C major or all the notes in C major. So Phrygian, it's the E Phrygian scale and the E minor chord. And then the notes that or the chords rather, that you're going to use to really establish that sound is by using the other chords that have what we would call the minor second note of the Phrygian scale. So in this scale, the next note is an F. So there's a half step between the E and the F. So any chord that has that F will really help you solidify that Phrygian sound. So start your progression on E minor and then move to the chords that have an F in it. So that would be like E minor to F. You could vamp back and forth, kind of just alternating. Or you could use part of the D minor chord because that has an F in it as well. If you want to get kind of funky, you could use the B diminished chord, but I kind of have those redded out because you're probably not going to use those quite as much, but they are useful if you want to add some transitional color to your chord progressions as well. You could also try doing the G7 chord, although the G7 chord will make it very likely that your listener's ear will want to resolve back to the C. And the idea of a mode is you want it to feel like you are using the note, the root note, as home. So we want everything to feel like it goes back to the E minor, right? So like I said, the chord options here that I have highlighted start with E minor, go to F, and then you could also try a D minor chord as well. And you can use these other chords in there too, but just make sure that you're really being thoughtful and using the notes that show up in the mode. So let's take a listen to what a chord progression in Phrygian would sound like. All right, so here we are back in HookPad, setting up an E Phrygian chord progression. So as our chart showed us, our chord options for really establishing that Phrygian feel is starting with the E minor chord and making that our home, that's our root. And then the F is the characteristic note because it's that flat second. So it's that half step right in the beginning that gives us that Phrygian feel. So I'm just going to vamp back and forth between E minor and F. So E minor and F. So this is a very Phrygian chord progression, and see what this feels like or what this sounds like to you. So it has kind of an exotic minor-y feel to it, but it doesn't sound just like a minor chord. It sounds like it has some exoticness to it. So when you're thinking about creating melodies on top of that, then you also want to try to make your listener understand that the root note is your root. So a lot of times you're going to start your melodies or at least really establish that note quite often. So an example here, I also want to use the F note a lot. So let's try just doing a simple melody. We'll do E, E, G, F, E, E, G. So that might sound like this. So we're kind of hovering around that E and that F with a few notes thrown in. This will be very Phrygian sounding. So now let's mess around with some different chords, but staying in E Phrygian. So like I said, you can use some of the other chords that are in the key, but you want to try to really make sure that your listener knows that you are in that root chord. So we're going to do the E minor. Let's go to a G, which starts to establish that it feels like maybe we're in, you know, E minor, because the E minor and G chord are in the E minor scale. And then I'm going to throw in the A minor, but then I'm going to throw in that F, which that F chord is not in the E minor scale. It's only in the E Phrygian scale. So you can create some kind of deception for your listener where they think they're in E minor, but then that F chord comes along and then it's like, oh, this is different. So that sounds like this. So do you hear that, where it's a little, there's just a little bit of something that it gets on the end. But what if we establish more of the the Phrygian sound with the D minor chord, and then let's put in the G chord here? What does that sound like? And then let's throw in some Phrygian melody notes just to see what that sounds like together. I'll just randomly. So isn't that kind of cool? You have the ability to create colors within your songwriting by using the same notes within your major scale. All right, again, take a screenshot of this chart, or I'll put a link in the description where you can download this chart as well. But as you can see, we were messing around in E Phrygian. You can use this chart to come up with chord progressions within any of the other modes as well. Just remember, start on your root, and then use the chords that have the characteristic note. So like Mixolydian, the characteristic note in that is that flat 7. So that means it's the F in G Mixolydian. So any chord that has an F in it is going to be a chord that helps to establish that mode. So start on the G and then go to maybe the D minor, or go to the F chord as well. A lot of Mixolydian songs just vamp between the G and the F, the 5 and the 4, and that gives you a really strong Mixolydian sound. So just to review how to make it obvious, or how to establish your mode, you want to start on the mode chord first. So whatever your root note is, use that as your home. That's where you're starting. That's where you're telling your listener, this is the mode I'm in. This is the chord that is home. So go there as often as you can and make sure your listener understands that, hey, this is my chordal center. Also, use the chords in the mode that contain the signature or characteristic tones, as I mentioned. So use that chart to start learning at least the C major chords, and then start transposing that into other scales and key signatures that you might use in your writing. And it can sometimes be too easy to resolve to the major scale and fall out of the modes. So this does take some practice. So I encourage all of you to play your instruments, play the different modes, get that sound sort of ingrained in your head, and then also experiment with making some chord progressions that are in the different modes. And since most of you are already familiar with the major scale and also the minor scales, I didn't include those here, but just to give you some jump off points, some cheat chord progressions, I gave you these to where you can start jamming on your instrument to get that sound of the mode. So with Dorian, just vamp back and forth between a D minor chord to an E minor chord and do that over and over again. And that really will establish what that Dorian mode sounds like. Phrygian, same thing. It's E minor to F, E minor to F. Lydian, go from the F to the G, the F to the G. It's the 4 to the 5 in the major scale. Mixolydian is that 5 to 4, 5 to 4, or the G to the F. I didn't include Locrian either because that's not very common to use, but use these chord progressions here on the screen as a jumping off point to start adding chords and really going where your ear takes you to experiment with these new colors that you may be discovering or experimenting with. All right, so that wraps up our conversation about the modes of the major scale. This is really just scratching the surface on what you can do with modes in your songwriting. And I think the biggest thing to take away from this today is that try to practice the basics in one key first. So use what I showed you in the key of C major to learn how to play all of the different modes in that key. And then from there, you can start experimenting with other keys that you write in, and you'll have a better grasp on what modes can do, because this is really just the beginning. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with modes, but this is enough to get you started and knowing that there's a lot of colors out there that you can use in your own songwriting. So that's going to wrap up today's video, but if you would like more information on working with harmony and working with chords, check out this past workshop that's on the screen. It's all about harmony, it's all about chords. And if you're kind of struggling to know what kind of chords to use when, the workshop can hopefully help you get a better sense of that. So I appreciate you watching this video. If you find it helpful, please subscribe. And then also in the description, there's a link to my online live workshops. I'd love to meet you, love to have you join some of the live workshops as well. So thank you for attending here at Home Songwriting, and let's get on to the next video. Let's do it.